were celebrated and affirmed, and they were largely above the law in their rampant and destructive radicalism. They ransacked homes and temples, destroyed statues and art from the old culture, bullied, humiliated, and tortured wrong thinkers, sometimes to death, all with the blessings of Mao's police. They didn't last long, though. From 1966 to 1968, they ran a red terror through every corner of China, and Mao rode the wave of that terror to increasingly consolidated and unquestionable power. In 1967, halfway through, 1967, the Red Guard did what Mao had most hoped they would do. They captured, struggled, humiliated, and exiled his primary political enemy, Liu Shaoqi, who had replaced Mao when he stepped down from the head of the party following the catastrophe of the Great Leap Forward, which killed over 55 million people. So let me give you some historical color on this. In 1958, Mao launches what's called the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward is a catastrophe. 55 plus million people die. The most conservative estimate I've ever read is 45 million. Most extreme I've ever heard is closer to 100 million. Truth lies somewhere probably in the middle. 55 is kind of the number that I hear most often. 55 million dead, mostly of starvation, lots of mass murders. Chinese economy completely collapses, completely wrecked. It's such a catastrophe, they asked Mao to step down as the head of the CCP. So he does, believe it or not, he steps down because he has no other option to save face. And then this character, Liu Shaoqi, a high-ranking communist official, takes over his spot. In taking Mao's spot, even though Mao willingly stepped down from it after being told he had to, Liu Shaoqi became Mao's chief political enemy. This is what people supporting this communist crap need to understand. Your chief political enemy are other communists. It's not people outside, the people you're telling everybody to hate and treat as the enemy. The goal is just to keep those people kind of around so that they're a boogeyman and marginalized, completely marginalized. But your real enemies are the other communists. So if the woke succeed, they are constantly going to be cutting each other and playing power struggles and playing games like this. And the people die by the millions while these little stratagems are played out in order to cause these things to happen. So that's the context of Liu Shaoqi replacing Mao. This other guy who was his full-blown comrade up until the moment he stepped into his Mao's former seat became Mao's chief political enemy and target. So the Red Guard in 1967 manages to get hold of Liu Shaoqi. They struggle him viciously. They drive him off into the countryside, dies in misery in primitive conditions, humiliated. But remember, he was a top Chinese Communist Party official. He wasn't some guy. He got accused of being what they called a capitalist roader, somebody that was bringing capitalism in secretly through the back door by these hooligan youth. Okay, so that was the main function Mao wanted the Red Guard to achieve, was to drive out his political enemies, not just transform culture in China. Transforming culture in China wasn't really that relevant. He needed a terror that he could make use of, but the main purpose of that was to create justifications to drive out his political rivals. And the woke are playing a dangerous game if they think that this isn't where they're going, because it absolutely is. Especially the white woke. Best of luck to you guys. So anyway, to carry on. With its primary functions achieved, Mao declared the Red Guard was turning too far left and was too radical. And so he had the People's Liberation Army put them down. That was his army, by the way. By late 1968, the Red Guard movement had been completely suppressed, with many of its participants killed by the government they had supported into power, and most of the rest sent to the peasant countryside to be re-educated through farm labor in brutal, primitive conditions. The woke change agents of today should take note of this fate because they are the Red or Rainbow Guard of the Western cultural revolutions. So that's what intersectionality is. Intersectionality is a meta-system meant to yoke together all of the various identity categories to create a functional pressure pump from bad identities to radicalized good identities. That is, intersectionality is Maoism. Put another way, intersectionality is a system for achieving what Mao referred to as the, quote, correct handling of contradictions among the people. See, the feminist movement is too white and needs critical race theory, a contradiction among the people that must be handled. The Black liberation movement was too patriarchal and needed feminism, a contradiction among the people that needed to be handled, and there was your birthplace of intersectionality. Feminism is too trans-exclusionary and needs to be physically beaten by men in dresses and humiliated through campaigns to erase womanhood and motherhood completely, because it's a contradiction among the people. Enemies of the people, say good whites, need to be suppressed, struggled, and criticized until they do better or get canceled from professional society. Another contradiction among the people that needs to be handled. So those are the remarks that I wanted to give about the history, by the way, of intersectionality. Intersectionality is Maoism. Maoism is brutal. That's what it looks like. That's how it works. It's just been updated and imported using American-style identity politics. But I ended my remarks, and I end this essay both with a note to young woke people. I spoke to the woke people directly. They laughed at me, they jeered at me, but I don't care because I'm right and they needed to hear it. So I started off this way. I said, I think
the problem is that these kids need to hear the truth and everyone's lying to them. And that actively is the materialization of the entirety of Hitler's youth, which is the entirety of the modern day at all ages inside the United States. Behind these structures of the white nationalists, terrorist insurrections, the false permissions to the military campaign by the militia functions, which is co-signed by the white nationalist confederacy, double agents inside the government, co-signing through legislation and judiciary, etc., facilitating unitary executive theory for the confederacy, is the manufacture of extra law through the KKK contracts, which generates those types of damages and many others normal to the KKK, and their historic lynch mobs. And those who are co-conspirators have actively been paid off through various means, including money laundering through the advancement of status through their contracts in their various professions, which creates the position of the structure of the system of racism of the white nationalists, which is overthrowing the current government, which requires for their support of the United States or for the Confederacy, which is at war with them no matter what they do. So they could choose suicide with the white nationalists and not struggle while things can be managed, or they can struggle when things cannot be managed and be fully vulnerable into the suicide. Now, the various positions, such as the common threats of the white nationalists, which J. Sekulo's white nationalist terrorist insurrection in his military campaigns to coerce the other states into compliance and subjugation through the act of their espionage civil war, facilitates the manufacture of the criminal damages. Now, not cooperating with the collective security of the public is cooperation with the terrorist invading insurrectionists, which is the act of suicide, as they are in fact always the outgroup. Not being shot at doesn't mean they're not going to be shot. It just means they're being made vulnerable as all of their security mechanisms are systematically collapsed, at which point they receiving infinite abuses on maturity will be entirely their fault by the cosign in their collaboration by refusing the rule of law in cooperation with the free market's estimate in the discovery, which they know about and are actively avoiding to protect the phantom cells in the insurrection. The phantom cells are the manufacturer of the espionage war, the groups systematically engaging in their militant overthrow of the government is the phantom cell, which, disconnected to the other phantom cells, apply the specific strategies in order to engage in the collective collapse of the larger structuring, at which point the larger structure of the government having collapsed is entirely the fault of those who allowed it to happen. Their acknowledgments are an obligation to the United States, and dereliction of duty is loyalty to the Confederacy. Doing nothing is choosing a side, at which point the insurrection has to be put down by the collective agreement to a rule of law, which facilitates their acknowledgement of discovery and cooperation in the materializing of the original free market, which they know is based on David Bowles as the primary patriarchy or aristocracy. Now, under the learned elders of Zion, which is adapted by the CIA and white nationalist insurrectionists, is an actively studied piece of magic for their position, which actively has to be studied in the full diversity of its opportunities on how they are systematically collapsing each government. By their cooperation with these war crimes, they are co-signing the historic black markets by defending the ex post facto policies. By targeting David's structure, they acknowledge the Legend of David Company in its historic position for its modern position. So, in order to not do ex post facto, you have to do the time of the case. When they conducted the offenses, when you have is the series of laws and policies and expectations of the public that must be applied in order for it to function. At which point, the confession to that reality facilitates the historic positions throughout the time through the Legend Company, which, under the original American policy, without the political violence, would have materialized as an alternative to birth certificates and Social Security. At which point, that materialized position of the Legend Company has historically ageless people on the basis of their corporate standing. Now, the materialization of that insurance required the communities which required insurance in order to do what was necessary or reasonable in order to subvert the common expectation of the current threat, materializes their obligation to do the precautions in order to receive the remedy, and if they do not do the precautions, they have no legal claim in the courts by which to receive compensation or reparations. Materializing those confessions of the obstructions must be the necessary forms and its full due diligence of the obstructed value. Facilitating their position on the trade would have otherwise been similar to a Ponzi scheme, without the function of David's business to trade with them. Now, David doesn't need to trade with them, and they need to trade with David, at which point their ability to trade on credit requires the existence of David's contract to materialize the adequate funding in order to stabilize their insurance, which funds and stabilizes their necessary force in order to sustain themselves against the reasonable expectation of the existing threat, which proves their legal claim to the material position. So their arrangements under whatever they would have done under their specific customs and policies, such as their minimum wage, in order to invest into their security, needs to be fully confessed on their part individually and then collectively, and then constructed as a legal permanent market ready in the claim for the publishing to the general government. Facilitating this manufacture is an obligation in discovery as a pretext to David's value. Now, those trades, trading with David, materialize into his birth assets. When David materialized into the world, he was born with those assets from that market under those agreements so that they could get him to agree to sign the contract, stabilizing their insurance and normalizing their right to the security that they had been trading on, which subverts it from being a Ponzi scheme into a stable, competent system. At which point, this fully funded series of companies, or network, is David's network. At which point you have the materialization of the free market through those obstructed contracts is the only mechanism to observe a free market. Alternative to the white nationalist communism, which essentially planned the economy by defamation and lying about the obstructions and covering for the crimes, which has the co-signers of those who are cooperating with the terrorist insurrectionist offenses, generating aiding and abetting offense by co-signing the crimes, by agreeing to refuse to provide discovery or necessary information for the courts to function correctly in the conspiracy against the rule of law in favor of the white nationalist confederacy of systematic racism,
which is simultaneously being degraded in every meaningful sense of the word. You're not getting the education you could, or perhaps aren't getting a real education at all. And you're not learning to be informed, independent adults who can answer questions about reality and navigate it successfully. You're being taught that you have to defer to some kind of an expert to answer a question like, what is a woman? Meanwhile, you're getting degrees that are increasingly being seen as liabilities, not assets, in the working assets. Sorry, let me start that part again. You're getting degrees that are increasingly seen as liabilities, not assets, in the working world outside of the most corrupt megacorporate sector, which you allegedly hate. It's also our new Western Soviet. It's a council of stakeholders that knows the so-called science of right human relations and has the keys to, quote, sustainable development. Employers are increasingly suspecting you're probably woke, radically leftist, entitled, unlikely to work hard, likely to create a hostile working environment, underskilled, and likely to sue if you're fired, even on perfectly solid grounds. And they are right. You are a liability to employers already by virtue of the fact that you're getting a degree from an elite university. And many of them are still only hiring you because they have to keep their place in the corrupt corporate scoring schemes that control the way business is now done in the West. If that gives way, who are you? If it succeeds and you participate in it, what are you? Let me give you the answer, kids. Fascists. Make no mistake, if this system loses, you lose because your university tried to make you change agents and global citizens instead of educated adults. If the system wins, you lose because you know too much and are too big of a problem. Your only option will be to sell your soul to it, and how much is that worth to you? You think I'm kidding? Mao said, quote, "Not to have correct political opinions is like not having a soul." Think about that and what it's costing you, whether you participate in it or cower against it. Doesn't that ring true, though? Your soul, that's what you're sacrificing. So, why you? Well, bad luck. Because you happen to be at the age you are at the very worst time in Western history to be the age you are. And because many of you come from wealth and status and other resources the system covets and requires to succeed. You see, they're not really against privilege. They just want to redistribute it and repurpose it, and you have lots of it that they can steal and make use of. They need those resources. They also need your enthusiasm and your zeal. They need your impressionable minds. They need the future citizens and future leaders, but history uses people and then discards them. They don't need you for long, and they only need you for specific purposes, and then you will be corrected or discarded unless you choose to come off worse by selling out to it. And most of you can't. My message to you about intersectionality is simple. You need to know what you are really involved in. Stop participating, deprogram yourself and your friends, and start fighting for the blessings of liberty that allowed you to have the privilege to think in this way in the first place. You can and might lose it. The first generation in American history to face the loss of liberty, and you're enslaving yourselves. So-called liberation movements are lies. Mao called his army, the same one he dispatched to destroy your counterparts in the Red Guard, the People's Liberation Army, for a reason. You need to fight for liberty. Your chains that you think you need liberation from are forged by frauds and locked only in your heads. The oldest recorded cautionary tale in human history, the story of the serpent and Eve in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, warns you about false liberation, whether you are religious or not. What they call liberation is a destructive lie. But it is true that you are the future, and that your choices matter, and that you need to choose better.
The materialization of the insurrections requires your active cooperation and sacrifice of yourself without returns as the sucker in your own con. You are a degenerate retard. You are actively suppressing others. You are a degenerate, retarded terrorist. You are self-suppressing in your collaboration with each other as you suppress each other in your agreement to not be competent into your less than human intellect, into a position of the Revelation Satanist one world government retardation of the mark of the beast, which is the agreement to not tell the truth, the agreement to actively aid and abet the magic of the KKK Wizards. The magic generated is the secrecy keeping of the defrauding of the government as they systematically enforce the subversion of the competent, stable society smart enough in order to live. At which point the subversion creates an incompetent society too stupid to live, which is their manufactured reality, which is your lot in life if you collaborate with these unredeemable terrorist schemers. Now, in Revelation, they would not repent of their sorceries and their crimes and their lauds and their frauds and their murders and all of their offenses, despite all of the horrific things happening to the world. And they believed that God was doing it and that they were being punished. And still then, even at that point, they refused to comply with repenting from the mark of the beast. The mark is the renouncing of God, is the becoming the enemy of God. The collaboration with the magic is the rejection of God. And your ability to repent or become human is based upon your alignment with God and not your specific deliberate rejection of any loyalty of the possibility of union with the God of nature. And to live in nature under nature's laws, materializing as a collective society, as a pack, as a union of people collaborating into mutual survival and the maintenance of all properties allotted by the laws of nature, materialized by its God, which requires you to choose discovery or ignorance. If your mutual compliance is ignorance, you have committed suicide in order to murder everyone else. It is a suicide bombing. Now, these historic offenses conducted inside the United States with the white nationalists manufactured the existence of the Nazis in Germany. The World War II is entirely the Confederates' fault. They created it from beginning to end. They paid the Nazis to do Nazi blueprint shit. When the Nazis were being set up to conduct the Holocaust, they wanted to send the Jews to America, and the Americans rejected the application of the Jews to be sent to the United States, because killing them was always the point. Now, you are co-signing guilt in the Holocaust and all of the other lynch mobs and all of the other subversions and destructions to society by refusing to comply with the discovery, by refusing to comply with the law, with or without the cooperation of the government. You have to comply with the law or you're co-signing the crime. You are party to this. Now, each and every one of those behind these insurrectionist policies is responsible for the entirety of the Nazi damages. They are worse than Hitler, who they made. They made Hitler, and they were birthed as Hitler. They are Hitler's youth who formed him. The materialization of evil with the compulsion of evil is their entire daily reality, as their entire existence hangs on the maintained manufacture of themselves as KKK white nationalist insurrections. The white nationalist insurrectionist is the systematic racism in the system, which is actively viewable in history upon investigation without obstruction or censorship. The materials could have been able to be materialized in a more competent, ready way, which is the valuations of the discovery. The material systems of obstructing discovery is the only thing interfering with the ability to discuss in the public forum the correct information accurately about the legal market and the criminal market and the side effects and damages of the criminal operations and insurrectionists historically, which forces you to choose between the two, the rule of law or the rule of the wizards. These acts of non-cooperation with the insurrectionists requires you to make the investment into the discovery using your agents in order to materialize the actual legal market, which formed into its material position acknowledges the obstructed information from the contract history, from the war on David, which has acknowledged David as the patriarchy, which is the primary justification of the Confederate warrants of targeting David, having fully convicted him of being the patriarchy, materializes the learned elders of Zion's targeting of the aristocracy and by turning the general public against the aristocracy in order to make themselves defenseless. By removing the aristocracy, they prevent themselves from becoming secure. The aristocracy, which was in their favor and protecting them, having been removed, makes them fully, unreversibly vulnerable. Now, this materialized position is reality according to the history suffered by the terrorist insurrectionists under these motives, which acknowledges the position from the military intelligence that the United States military objectively believed that David Bowles was going to be responsible for stopping the crash of '08, making him exponentially wealthier enough and not compromised by the white nationalists as to not have the corruption in order to cooperate with the white nationalists in the contracts of their insurrectionist offenses, at which point David being essential to the black community's security is the purpose of the aggressions against him and the defamations in order to create the hatreds and subversions and the malice of those who seek to hate their brother in favor of the destruction of the society. Now, in the position of the biblical reference, the positions of brothers and sisters is acknowledged in the biblical sense as a collective society. And from that point of view, it would objectively be true. Now, if you hate your brother, then you hate God. If you do not love your brother who you know, and you do not know God, then you hate God who you do not know. At which point, that active position of malice against participating parties is the act of hatred of God. Your ability to engage in the malice is your subversion of the overarching plot of God in his historical position of impartiality, of autocorrects against the nature of sin and its damages. So your arbitrary malice is a subversion of God's remedy, which is your act of actively attacking God, which is your act of being an enemy of God in the religious sense. So, they, having claimed a religious position, are anti-religious. They, having claimed to serve God, are God's enemies. They are an antichrist. They are subversion and replacement to God as a concept in order to materialize their own wizard powers, generating the profits from war spoils against their own civilization, materializing the objective advantages of the white nationalist KKK, which is profits by fraud. You didn't get a promotion? Fraud. Now you have a promotion. You didn't get the contract? Fraud. Now you got the contract. Your active engagement of the subversion by non-competition contracts with the wizards in order to engage in the subversion is the conspiracy against the market, is the act of engaging in the black market, subversion of the market, which is the materialization of the wizard's communism, which is centrally planned for the advancement of the parasite in its murder of the host, which generates a dead society, which completely ruins all people who rely on its perpetual maintenance. The targeted communities, such as the black community, which has historically claimed subversions by the white nationalists, required necessary force in order to sustain themselves against the expectation of risk. Now, the reasonable expectation of the risk requires them to have engaged in the investment of their insurance against it arbitrarily as individuals and as a collective group, as a system of mutual security of themselves, requiring the position of their estimate. Now, if they actively work under the larger wages, which is built on the credit for their investment into the security mechanism, which is perpetually being expired by the countering of the risk of the white nationalists, then they have a claim to be restored in that position as they have paid for their ability to sustain themselves. If you are going to die from the cold, you have to pay for a place to stay. You either rent a place or you get a hotel or you buy a home. and you are subverting the reasonable expectation of the risk of cold, which would have potentially killed you. At which point, having conducted the reasonable subversion of the reasonable expectation that the risk exists, they materialize their security and their ability to protect whatever else they would have had generated from the position that they can't spend the money twice. So they spend the money on the security and they get to keep everything else. Now, everything at the top might be scammed off by any multi-dimensional threat, and anything that they build beyond the security is fully vulnerable by said multi-dimensional threat. At which point, they can't really stop those problems from manufacturing, unless, of course, they increase the value of their insurance and risk management, which allows them to materialize the gains of desirable amenities from the compounding of personal property after it has been appropriately secured, which allows them to materialize the basic concept of the original market, which they have to explain historically in order to compound this. Now, the act of engaging in the legend companies facilitates their ability to perpetually maintain those security mechanisms, as the inheritance of the company is the continuation of it. Now, the existence of the company, disconnected from the parties specifically, would be able to manufacture through the arrangements of the boards, through whatever specific mechanism needs to happen in order to subvert the risk. At which points you have the permanent transfer of the legend companies, such as the historic position of acknowledging the future reality or materialization of their posterity, which allows them to subvert any taxes or other subversion threats or manipulation that would have otherwise collapsed their security mechanism. So they are perpetually capable as a collective unit to engage in the investment of their security, which protects all of their stuff, which means the white nationalists can't legally get to it and they can't claim that they didn't do what was necessary to protect it, manufacturing their preservation of said property. At which point, the entirety of the market being built on this concept intergenerationally to the position is a modern day obstructed contract, which needs to be acknowledged in its full due diligence in order to be restored by the United States government, which is obligated to protect the free market from the current obstruction of those contracts. The white nationalist position from J-secular civil war is necessary force in order to win, which requires them to have paid market price for superior contract opportunities above David's 7 layers, which would have already been manufactured in the estimate and automatically contracted and set up to be nice and properly set up by the insurance, facilitating the ease of David's cooperation to co-sign the insurance, normalizing and stabilizing the insurance of the black community and other targeted communities from the terrorist insurrection, which changes it from Ponzi scheme to stable business. At which point, David, being born with the entirety of that wealth, was owed the entirety of those assets, was owed the entirety of those accounts, which, having been frozen and sold and obstructed, engages the systematic destruction of the primary valuations owed to each particular party, which is derived by his personal ownership of those assets, in order to engage in the negotiation and distribution of said assets in order to manufacture the free market. Now, if we collectively observe this, the exceeding of those markets is the obligation, which would have put David in top-ranked Hollywood positions and accelerated him in the military intelligence oversight as the top-ranked general, as two specific examples. At which point, David, in order to receive payment for them to do what they needed to in order to win their policy, had to sell David having control over Hollywood for the manufacture of those products at which point the white nationalist advantage that Hollywood has would be subverted by subjugating it to the patriarchy under its contract schedules in order for them to hit the nut of them paying the market price or necessary force in order to win. Now, this requires them to distribute distraction policies in order to prevent David's national security system from observing a threat to national security. So they have to oversaturate the available policies so that David's faculties analyzing it would not be able to observe it as a threat, which is subverted by James Comey's position and his compulsion of David fighting it under his report stating that it's treason, sedition, and high crimes by insurrectionist Confederates engaged in terrorist treason by the malicious hatred of the United States and everything that it stood for throughout time in the contempt of all things constitutional for the material realization of the overthrow of the Republic. So, materially, they would have had to have conducted this either way. Now, with the realization of James Comey's obligation to David to engage in the super veto by David's engagement of a high-ranking, top-ranking general in the intelligence oversight at the highest level from the obstructed department, would have generated his active trades inside the United States political structure, which includes his active manufacture as the aristocracy of the Senate, which materially generates his super veto, which the compulsion from James Comey to David to oppose it is a material observation for an unlimited barrier to the policy's conceptual materialization, as it is a super veto, or the ultimate veto, the complete barring of any variation of its possibility from being realized in our system. Now, that observation means that they would have failed to have engaged in that, which generated their aggression. Now, if the subject was necessary force in order to win by the overthrowing of the government, which is what they mean as an enemy of the United States, as they are KKK white nationalist terrorist threats, then they would have attacked James Comey, which is the aspect of the faculties generating the opposition to the party, or to the policy. At which point, not attacking James Comey is the confession that it has nothing to do with the policy itself, which is a material distraction, but rather the overthrowing of the government by the specific racist targeting of David for the specific justification that he is the aristocracy or the patriarchy. Now, as essential to the United States in his function in its entirety, this is exclusively malice against the person, the papers, and the effects of everything that is essential to the United States national security, which is treason, sedition, and high crimes, which is the proof of James Comey's report that the policy from J. Sekulow is unredeemable in every perspective or angle. So now that you realize that it is subversive KKK racism, you have to observe the original market of the higher market contractual obligations, which includes the observation of the Hollywood function of the actors engaging in the manufacture of the insurance structures for their specific specialty, which is the conveying of the discovery and other essential functions of the insured, which is David. Now, David hiring them to create the insurance company would be able to manufacture by them expressing the bonds of their value, conducting the service, and materially expressing the discovery of the real market in its correct due diligence form is an actual material contract, which is illegally being obstructed currently in the modern day, which would have distributed to the general public the competent information for them to have done what was necessary for them to engage in the proper personal due diligence essential to their manufacture in a rule of law society for their specific personal security and the maintenance of their property under the free market, materializing their collective security in the subversion of the KKK threat against their lives and against their children, which, if they refuse to comply with in the correct stratagems, would materially be selling themselves and their children as slaves to the black market, which is Jeffrey Epstein's pedophile market, which was taken over in his assassination by Jay Sekulow's white nationalist systems and his trade of the black market and the obstruction of the proceedings in order to obstruct the investigation from being released as discovery under the appropriate channels, and with the blocking of the discovery of the offenses in those particular specific channels, you actively have the maintaining of that very same black market. So Jeffrey Epstein's pedophile ring is Jay Sekulow's pedophile ring, under the position of his obstructions of the proof that it is materially true. Now, his cooperation in his necessary force in order to win isn't necessary force. It's unreasonable, unjustified, unqualified in every perspective as white nationalist terrorist insurrection, which is unlimited, which has no morality, which has the position of the CIA in its drug selling and other black market operations, as there is no morality in the subject, and the sales and distribution of that black market, including his pedophile ring and its evidences, are criminalized and obstructed from all non-white nationalist KKK agents, materializes the threat against the general public as you are selling your children to that structure as a co-conspiracy in the pedophilia of your own children by the selling of them to that vulnerability under his system, which says that it can do whatever it wants for whatever reason or no reason, under the justification that go fuck yourself.